It begins with a silence that feels almost unbearable. The children of Africa are still fast asleep, the narrator warns, too busy running away from Africa. That image alone is enough to sting. It is not just about distance, it is about forgetting. And history has shown us time and time again what happens when voices in Africa dare to remember too loudly. Patrice Lumumba in Congo, Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso, Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, all silenced when their message struck too close to the truth. And today we add another name to that list, Dr. Arikana Chihombori Quao. She was not an activist shouting from the streets. She was the official African Union ambassador to the United States, standing in Washington as the voice of a continent. Her job on paper was ceremonial shake hands, cut ribbons, smile for the cameras. But instead she broke the script. She told the truth. Africa, she said, is still colonized, only this time the chains are hidden in contracts, currencies, and aid programs. Ask yourself this: if her words were nonsense, why fire her? You do not silence clowns, you laugh at them. Yet, Dr. Arikana was dismissed, erased from the stage, because she became too dangerous not for Africa, but for those who still profit from Africa's silence. And that is why this story matters to you, no matter where you live. Because once we strip away the illusions of independence, once we see Africa for what it truly is, the engine of the global economy, we must also ask who really benefits and who has been robbed. Stay with us as we uncover why Dr. Arikana's voice was silenced, what it reveals about the chains that still bind Africa, and why leaders like President Ibrahim Traoré are rising to finish the fight. Please share this video if you believe the truth should never be punished, and subscribe if you believe that justice is more important than silence. She wasn't supposed to make waves. Dr. Arikana Chihombori Quao's position as the African Union ambassador to the United States came with a script: wear the elegant suits, smile politely at receptions, cut ribbons, host dignitaries, and never disturb the peace. Diplomacy in the eyes of the powerful is theater. You are allowed to play the part, but you are never allowed to change the play. But Arikana didn't just stray from the script, she set it on fire. Instead of delivering rehearsed speeches about partnerships and shared progress, she picked up the microphone and detonated the illusion. Her words were blunt, her tone unshakable. Africa is still colonized, only in new packaging. Those words landed like thunder in Washington. They echoed far beyond her intended audience. They exposed a truth too many had grown comfortable ignoring: that freedom in Africa is often just a stage performance, while the real power remains elsewhere. Consider what she revealed. 14 African countries still use the CFA franc, a currency printed in France, guaranteed by the French treasury, and controlled outside their borders. Half of their foreign reserves are required to be kept in Paris. Imagine working your whole life depositing your paycheck into a bank and being told you may only use your own money if a foreign government says yes. That is not independence. That is financial slavery with a polished name. She went further. She reminded audiences that France maintains military presence in these countries, that African armies are trained and equipped under French oversight, and that military alliances between neighbors are forbidden without Paris's blessing. She laid bare the web of contracts signed decades ago that continue to grant Western corporations first access to Africa's oil, uranium, and gold, the very lifelines of modern civilization. These were not abstract ideas. Arikana pointed directly to Niger, where uranium fuels the streetlights of Paris while families in Niamey struggle in the dark. She pointed to Nigeria, where millions of barrels of oil flow out every day, yet ordinary citizens wait in endless fuel lines. And she reminded her listeners that Africa's aid packages from the West were not acts of generosity, but carefully designed leashes meant to keep nations obedient. What made her voice explosive was not only what she said, but where she said it. Speaking these truths on American soil before American audiences stripped the mask off the story the West tells itself. Africans already knew this reality. But when Americans, Europeans, and outsiders were forced to hear it from an official AU ambassador, the danger changed shape. Silence was no longer safe, and so the gloves came off. The African Union, under immense pressure, dismissed her. No celebration of bravery, no defense of her honesty, just a quiet removal, as if cutting out the infection of truth would keep the body of neo-colonialism intact. This was the event that shook many Africans awake. Because firing Dr. Arikana was never about her being wrong. It was about her being too right. It was about protecting an old order that depends on silence, compliance, and illusions of freedom. And once her words escaped the room, they could not be contained again. Dr. Arikana's dismissal became more than a personal loss. It became a mirror, a reminder that the system is designed not to applaud courage, but to suffocate it. And it drew a sharp line in the sand for African leaders today, a line that men like Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso are daring to cross by declaring that the natural resources of their nations belong only to their people. There is a moment in every story when the tension becomes unbearable, when the truth refuses to stay buried. For Dr. Arikana, that moment came the instant she declared, "If colonialism truly ended, then why does Africa remain chained to its former masters?" The room froze. The question was not rhetorical. It was a knife cutting through decades of polite lies. She laid out the evidence with precision. 14 African nations still shackled to the CFA franc, half their reserves locked in Paris, military bases dotted across their soil commanded by French officers, laws preventing them from buying weapons or forming alliances without French approval. Even the language of instruction in schools dictated by a foreign state. Independence, she explained, was never independence. It was a costume stitched together for parades while the real machinery of power kept humming beneath the surface. Her words did not float quietly into the air. They detonated. Because when truth is spoken in the heart of the empire, it carries a different weight. Africans had always known these facts. But to say it openly in Washington to audiences who believed Africa's suffering was self-inflicted, that was dangerous. And history shows us what happens when voices get too close to dangerous truths. Patrice Lumumba, the Congolese prime minister, who insisted that Congo's resources belong to Congolese people, was assassinated in 1961. Thomas Sankara, the young revolutionary of Burkina Faso who nationalized land and demanded dignity for Africans, was shot in 1987. Muammar Gaddafi, who tried to create a pan-African currency backed by gold, was bombed into oblivion in 2011. Arikana's fate was softer, but the pattern was unmistakable. She was not applauded, not debated, not refuted. She was silenced, quietly fired, stripped of her position, erased from the official record. But here is the paradox. Silencing her only amplified her message. Across Africa, her dismissal became proof that what she said was true. Because if her claims were absurd, why would the African Union and its Western backers react with such panic? You don't silence fools, you laugh at them. You silence prophets because their words can move mountains. The reaction spread like wildfire. In Ouagadougou, citizens whispered her name alongside Sankara's, calling her a new voice of resistance. In Niger and Mali, where French troops had long been stationed, her words resonated with a new urgency as soldiers and civilians alike demanded an end to foreign control. And in Burkina Faso, President Ibrahim Traoré stood before his people and declared the same principles she had dared to speak. The resources of Burkina Faso belong to the people of Burkina Faso. Even abroad, her firing struck nerves. Diaspora communities in New York, Paris, and London echoed her warnings. African students at American universities began to ask uncomfortable questions about where their country's wealth was going. Journalists replayed her speeches, highlighting the raw clarity of her message: aid is not charity, it is a leash. In the corridors of power, however, the response was fear disguised as dismissal. Western officials labeled her radical, controversial, or simply unhelpful. The African Union tried to move on, pretending she had never stood at the microphone. But the more they ignored her, the louder her absence became. This was the climax of her story, not the speech itself, but the reaction it provoked. Because when institutions designed to protect freedom crush the truth instead, they reveal their true allegiance. And that revelation became the spark that ignited a wider awakening across Africa, one that continues to this day. Dr. Arikana had pulled back the curtain. The empire was exposed. And though she lost her title, she gained something far greater. She became a symbol, a living reminder that Africa's fight for real independence is far from over, and that the battle lines are now drawn not only in African capitals, but in the hearts of Africans everywhere. The dismissal of Dr. Arikana did not end with her. It sent ripples across Africa's political and social fabric, exposing the fragility of a system that still treats sovereignty as a performance rather than a reality. At the heart of the reaction was the United Nations. On paper, the UN is the stage where all nations are equal, where peace and justice are defended. But as Arikana reminded her audiences, Africa is locked out of the rooms where real power is decided. 54 countries, more than a quarter of the world's membership, yet not a single permanent seat on the Security Council. No veto power, no binding influence. The symbolism was crushing. Africa provides the resources that power global industries. Africa provides the soldiers for peacekeeping missions. Africa provides the battlegrounds where resolutions are tested. But when it comes to decisions, sanctions, wars, interventions, Africa is voiceless. One yes from Washington, Paris, or London outweighs 54 no's from Africa. That is not representation. That is control dressed up as diplomacy. This reality triggered a wave of political disillusionment. Citizens began to see Independence Days and national anthems for what they often were, symbols without substance. If their governments could not even defend their own reserves, their own money, or their own voice at the UN, then what exactly had been achieved since the flags were raised in the 1960s? Social consequences followed quickly. On the streets of Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey, protesters began invoking her words. Africa is not poor, it is robbed. Murals of Sankara appeared alongside painted images of Arikana. Students in universities across Ghana and Kenya staged debates not just about economics, but about legitimacy, who truly governs us, our presidents, or the contracts signed in Paris and Washington. At the political level, her firing emboldened a new generation of leaders willing to confront the system head-on. In Burkina Faso, Captain Ibrahim Traoré positioned himself as the antithesis of silence, declaring openly that Burkina Faso's gold land and future belongs solely to its people. Niger and Mali echoed the sentiment, expelling French troops and rejecting military agreements that had long placed their sovereignty under foreign oversight. What began as whispers of rebellion hardened into policies of resistance. But this awakening came with risks. Governments that aligned themselves with her message found themselves under pressure, sanctions, aid cuts, even threats of destabilization. International media branded them populists or dictators, recycling the same narratives once used to delegitimize Sankara or Lumumba. At the same time, many citizens, seeing the price of confrontation, wrestled with fear. Would speaking too loudly invite the same fate their heroes once suffered? Yet the very act of silencing Arikana forced Africans to confront this choice. Remaining quiet meant perpetuating a cycle of dependency. Speaking out meant danger, but also dignity. Her dismissal, therefore, was not just a bureaucratic decision. It was a mirror held up to Africa's face. And in that reflection, millions began to see the truth. Independence without power is an illusion, and illusions cannot feed families, build hospitals, or light homes. In the years since, her voice has become part of the political bloodstream of the continent. From diaspora communities in the U.S. to youth activists in the Sahel, her story circulates as proof that the fight for sovereignty is no longer optional. It is survival. From Washington's perspective, Dr. Arikana's words were more than inconvenient, they were destabilizing, because they struck at the heart of a carefully crafted narrative that Africa is poor, helpless, and in need of saving. For decades, this image justified aid programs, debt arrangements, and military interventions. But when she told American audiences that Africa is not poor, it is being robbed, the mask slipped. Imagine for a moment what that means for the United States. American tech companies depend on cobalt from Congo to power every smartphone and electric car. American agribusinesses depend on African soil to sustain grain markets. Even the push for green energy relies heavily on lithium, uranium, and solar potential from Africa. If Africans began demanding fair prices, or worse, if they decided to process their own resources before exporting, the U.S. economy would feel the shockwaves instantly. This is why her firing mattered so much in Washington. It was not just about silencing an ambassador. It was about protecting a global system in which Africa's resources flow out cheaply, while profits remain abroad. When she challenged that order, she indirectly challenged Wall Street, Silicon Valley, and the Pentagon all at once. Globally, the reaction was equally tense. In Paris, her words landed like thunder because they cut straight into the heart of France's post-colonial empire. Without uranium from Niger, French nuclear plants dim. Without CFA franc reserves, French banks weaken. To hear an African Union ambassador denounce this system publicly in America risked stirring anger across the continent and embarrassment across Europe. Even in Europe itself, the ripple effects were surprising. Officials in Hungary, for example, openly admitted relief when U.S. aid agencies pulled out, echoing Arikana's warnings that foreign involvement often manipulates domestic politics. If European allies could voice such sentiments, then how much more explosive would it be if African leaders united around the same message? In the global south, her words resonated like a call to arms. Leaders in Latin America and Asia recognized the pattern instantly. Debt traps manipulated currencies, extraction masked as development. The more she spoke, the clearer it became that Africa's struggle was not isolated. It was part of a global architecture designed to keep entire regions dependent. For African diaspora communities in the United States, her firing was especially painful. Many saw in her a rare bridge, an African official speaking truth to power in the very heart of Washington. By silencing her, America sent an unmistakable message. Africa's truth is welcome only when it flatters, never when it exposes. And yet, paradoxically, this attempt to erase her only amplified her reach. Her speeches circulated online, replayed in classrooms, shared in church gatherings, and whispered in community halls. In the U.S., older African Americans began comparing her courage to the civil rights leaders of their own past. Abroad, Pan-African voices drew a straight line from Sankara to Traore to Arikana, weaving her into the living tapestry of Africa's resistance. For the world, the lesson was clear: suppressing Africa's truth may delay the reckoning, but it cannot prevent it. Because every time a voice like Arikana's is silenced, the silence itself becomes proof that the system has something to hide. The story of Dr. Arikana is not just about one woman losing her title. It is about what happens when truth collides with power. She reminded the world that Africa is not poor, it is being robbed. She revealed that independence for many nations was never more than a costume, and for that she was punished, quietly removed, silenced. But the deeper lesson is this: silencing voices does not erase their message. It multiplies it. Patrice Lumumba was assassinated, yet his vision still haunts the Congo. Thomas Sankara was shot, yet his words still echo in Burkina Faso. And Dr. Arikana, though dismissed, now stands as a symbol of defiance that no dismissal can contain. Here lies the warning. If the system continues to suppress those who dare to speak, the backlash will only grow. Africans are beginning to connect the dots: the CFA Franc, the military bases, the contracts, the silence at the UN. Once these truths spread wide enough, they become unstoppable. And when that happens, the balance of power will not shift slowly, it will break suddenly. For Americans and Western audiences, there is also a message. The prosperity of the developed world rests on Africa's resources. The energy in your home, the battery in your phone, the food on your table, these all trace back to African soil. But justice delayed cannot be justice denied forever. If Africa decides tomorrow to keep its wealth at home, the global economy will tremble. The only real question is whether the West will embrace a fair partnership or cling to a collapsing order. In Burkina Faso, President Ibrahim Traoré has already drawn the line: the gold, the land. The future of his people will no longer be signed away. Mali and Niger have echoed his stance. This new generation of leaders, inspired by the sacrifices of those before them, refuses to play along with the old script. So we end with this question for you. Do you think that President Ibrahim Traoré's strategies can truly dismantle neo-colonialism, or will Africa need an entirely new generation of leaders to finish the work? Your answer matters. Because history is not written only by those in power, it is shaped by those who choose to listen, to speak, and to act. Please share this video if you believe that Africa's truth should never again be silenced. Subscribe if you believe that justice is more important than silence, and join us in amplifying the voices they fear most.